皆様、本日は緊急オンラインセミナー、ウクライナにおけるインフラ破壊と環境に配慮した復興の現状、現場からの報告と提言にご参加くださいまして、誠にありがとうございます。公益財団法人日本グローバルインフラストラクチャー研究財団、日本 GIF で専務理事を務めております中山幹康です。僭越ながら本日の司会を務めます。当財団の長年の協力者であり、私にとっては20年来の友人である環境法研究所のカール・ブルック国際部長が本年10月にウクライナの首都キーウを訪問されました。本日の緊急セミナーではブルック博士を講師にお招きしました。ロシアによるキーウへの攻撃は限定的でしたが、ウクライナ南部と東部のインフラは甚大な被害を被りました。戦況は足踏み状態ながら、ともかくも復興を進めなければなりません。日本の災害復興などの技術や経験をウクライナの復興に生かすことも、日本の国際貢献であるとともに、日本の企業にとってのビジネスチャンスでもあります。インフラ再建は迅速であることが要請されるものの、環境への影響も考慮する必要があります。ブルック博士は環境法の分野で国際的に著名であり、ウクライナ当局から復興計画を策定する際に、環境への配慮がどのようになされるべきかについて、専門家としての助言を求められました。ウクライナ復興に日本が貢献するためには、まず復興の基本方針やルールについて知る必要があります。本セミナーでは、ブルック博士はウクライナ政府やパートナーとの議論に基づいて、ウクライナのインフラ破壊とウクライナ政府の具体的な復興計画に関する最新の情報を提供してくださいます。また、ブルック博士と私とのディスカッションや参加者との質疑応答を通じて、復興と環境保護の調和を具体的に実現するための方法論について、ブルック博士の見解を伺います。さて、ブルック博士による講演及び私とのディスカッションの後で質疑応答の時間を持ちます。ブルック博士へのご質問は、この画面の下にあります Q&A より文字として入力していただければ幸いです。ご質問は日本語でも英語でも結構です。それでは、ブルック博士、お願いいたします。
Thank you so much. It is an honor to join you. I remember addressing GIF about the impacts of Hurricane Katrina um, back in 2006, 17 years ago. Since then, I have had the privilege of partnering with GIF on many initiatives. So it is wonderful to be here. And it is wonderful to continue the relationship with Nakayama Sensei. Let me share my PowerPoint. As Professor Nakayama mentioned, I had the opportunity to visit Ukraine in October, particularly Lviv in the west and Kyiv, the capital in the center of the country. This was building on about 25 years of work that I have had on and off in Ukraine. I first visited Ukraine in October of 1998. So I came back exactly 25 years later. And over the years, I have helped Ukraine to develop a number of environmental laws on environmental impact assessment, on what are called pollutant release and transfer registers, or PRTRs. And these are basically reports of pollution that is released to the air, water, and soil. And work on public participation, work on climate change. So a number of different issues over the years. Specifically, I was invited back to help not so much on environmental governance, but on accountability for wartime environmental damage. Today, though, I'm going to be speaking primarily about the environmental impact, the infrastructure impacts of war. I'll talk a little bit about the environmental impacts. And then I'm going to talk about the future, two futures. One is the green recovery that a lot of people are aiming for. And the other is accountability for Russia and for Russians for the damage to infrastructure and the environment. So I'll talk about the impacts, then recovery, and then accountability. In terms of the impacts, start with the impacts to hydropower dams. About 10% of Ukraine's electricity comes from hydropower. And most of these are dams along the Dnipro River, you can see here. And during the war, dams have been targeted and infrastructure related to dams targeted, so that the hydropower capacity has been cut from 6,000 megawatts to 3,500 megawatts. And reservoirs of a number of the dams dropped, sometimes 2 meters. The most dramatic impact was Kakhovka Dam, which was, I'll just show you this, that's the last dam here. You can see the big lake that is impounded behind the dam. So this is the one that was targeted on earlier this year, June 6th, which ironically is World Environment Day. The reservoir held 18 cubic kilometers. Again, that's a lot of water, 18 cubic kilometers of water. That's used for agriculture, for energy, for municipal purposes. And when the dam it burst the dam, there were a series of detonations here that required evacuation of over 80 towns and settlements, and the floodwaters reached 32 feet. It's estimated that more than 60,000 buildings, homes, businesses, government infrastructure, more than 60,000 buildings were damaged, often with more than a foot of floodwater. Some of them washed away. It's unclear, I should say, it's contested how the dam blew up. The Russians blame Ukraine, and Ukraine and the West blame the Russians. You can see here, this is the impoundment. And then 2 weeks after the explosion, you can see the main channel here. But most of the land that had been under the impoundment has been exposed. It should also be noted that Ukraine has had heavy use of fertilizers and pesticides and industrial operations in this area. And so there's concern also that some of the sediments that have been trapping these chemicals have been released downstream, exposing people to the pollution. Another dramatic effect is with respect to nuclear power plants. Ukraine has 5 nuclear power plants in the country. 4 of them are operational and 1 is non-operational. The non-operational power plant is Chernobyl, very well known. And the 4 operational ones are Zaporizhia, South Ukraine, Khmelnytsky, and Rivne. It should be noted that Chernobyl, as I said, is not producing energy anymore, but it was within days of the war starting. It was seized and used as a launching point for Russian forces who dug into the soil, turned it up with tanks and other military equipment. All of this is to say, suddenly some of the Russian soldiers were not feeling too well. It's unclear how many suffered from radiation poisoning, but after a couple of months, Russia withdrew from Chernobyl. More disturbing, though, is Zaporizhia. Zaporizhia is one of the largest nuclear power plants in Europe. And starting March 24th, so about a month after the war started, Russia launched its first attack on the new operational nuclear facility at Zaporizhia. There are 6 reactors. None were damaged in the attack. Ultimately, Russia occupied Zaporizhia and continued to run it, continued to force the Ukrainian operators to keep the plant going. It has been controversial because, in part, Russians have, from time to time, launched attacks, missile attacks from Zaporizhia. So if the Ukrainians want to fire back to where the missiles came from, they cannot do it. And so it's using the nuclear power plant as a shield. One of the other aspects that's very interesting about this the conflict is the targeting of the infrastructure associated with nuclear power plants, including the targeting of incoming electricity. And this is important because many of the power plants are designed so that they need some basic amount of electricity from the outside to run so that they can then generate a lot more electricity. And the concern about targeting the related related energy infrastructure is that could, if it is shut down, lead to destabilization of the nuclear power plants. There have been blackouts ranging from several hours to several days. The IAEA has had a presence in all 4 of the operational nuclear facilities, monitoring the situation there. There's another place that doesn't get much coverage. This is the Kharkiv Neutron Facility. And this is a research laboratory that produces radioisotopes with medical and industrial applications. So this is not a power plant, but it has nuclear material, not fissile. It's not going to go critical, but it has the same chemical and radiological properties that make it dangerous. And from March 6th to September 9th, the Kharkiv Institute of Physics, and particularly the Neutron facility, was attacked multiple times using a variety of drones, bombs, missiles. Thankfully, it appears that none of the attacks has resulted in radiological damage to the public yet. The industrial electrical facilities have seen 60 attacks by November 8th of this year. And since then, we've seen even more. It's expected to be over 100 attacks. This is interesting because a lot of the attacks, this is not targeting the military. It's targeting life in Ukraine, generally speaking. And we've seen over 40% of the electrical facilities damaged and 30% destroyed. So that especially in the east and south, hundreds of towns do not have consistent access to heat or electricity. Moreover, natural gas networks have been disrupted. This is in an area that has temperatures that often plunge below 20 degrees below zero. That's minus 20 degrees centigrade during the winter. And a lot of this is trying to make life miserable for the civilian population so that Ukraine compromises. We've seen literally millions of households with disruption to electricity and heat that lasts for hours and sometimes up to 10 days. There's an ongoing effort to repair power lines. Dozens of the civilian workers have been killed or injured as they're trying to repair that. I should also note that the eastern part of the country and the south is the area of Ukraine that is historically industrialized. They have a lot of steel, a lot of chemical manufacturing, and some of these plants, like the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol, have become centers where the Ukrainian soldiers seek refuge and conduct attacks on Russians, which make themselves then targets. And a lot of the industrial facilities have been thoroughly bombed and destroyed, raising questions about what happens after the war, both for public health and for the environment. Water infrastructure is another frequent target of Russian attacks. This includes drinking water infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure, and water sanitation facilities. Within the first 2 months, again, just to be clear, talk about the first 2 months of the war, 1.4 million had no access to running water. Another 4.6 million had limited access. The Ukrainian government has had to drain water from the reservoirs in order to slow Russian advances. Kyiv, which is relatively far from the battle lines, 80% of Kyiv's residents have experienced water shortages at least 2 times in the last 2 months. In the first 2 months, again, we saw at least 8,000 kilometers of roads destroyed. Roadways are important for the military to move, as you see here. That makes them military targets, for both the Russians and for the Ukrainians. 300 bridges on major highways have been destroyed. Initially, it was estimated that the cost in repairing the roads would be about 277 billion euros. Now that's estimated to be more than 875 billion. So almost certainly a threefold increase there. Bridges are complicated, in part because of the political system that Ukraine has. About 5,500 of the bridges are the responsibility of the Ukrainian national government, but that leaves more than 10,000 bridges that are the responsibility of oblasts. These are the subnational authorities and municipalities. And so even as the bridges have been destroyed, one of the most common things that they've done, at least in the short term, is to build pontoon bridges. These are very temporary bridges that are basically, you put pontoons or kind of like balloons in the water, very big balloons. And you put the plates of metal over them, and trucks and cars can go over the pontoons. Netherlands, Czechia, and Germany, among other countries, have all donated pontoon bridges to Ukraine. These are temporary fixes. It's a very special bridge. This is the Kerch Bridge. It is the only link between Crimea and Russia. And as you may recall, in 2014, so long, 7 years, 7 years before this conflict started. 8 years before this conflict started, Russia occupied the Crimea. And this is the island south of Ukraine. It's part of Ukraine, but they occupied the island. The Kerch Bridge is the only direct link between Crimea and Russia. And Ukraine has attacked the bridge twice, once in 2022 and once in 2023. In 2023, the attack saw the first use of the newly developed Sea Baby drone, which is a water-based drone that delivered about 850 kilograms of explosives to the bridge's support beams. It's important to note that targeting this bridge was not merely an attempt to halt the movement of Russian weapons across the bridge, but also to contest Russian sovereignty in the annexed regions of Ukraine. There's a lot of other infrastructure that has been damaged in the conflict. A year into the conflict, the Kyiv School of Economics estimated that more than 3,000 educational institutions, 900 cultural facilities, 168 sports facilities, and others had all been damaged or destroyed, with an estimated total damage of approximately 143 billion. And so the damage to these particular institutions was estimated at about 2.2 billion, with a broader range of damage, including roads, bridges, dams, and these facilities being 143 billion. I want to talk a little bit about what I think is a really innovative approach to assessing impacts of the conflict. And I will note that there have been some innovations on the environmental side. I'm not going to focus on that today, but I'm happy to discuss it in the question and answer. But for infrastructure, the Kyiv School of Economics has started a process of assessing the impacts on infrastructure. And the primary reason is not for liability, although they're hoping it could be used for that, but more to plan recovery. And the question is, what's the damage? Where should the priorities be? And it starts with drone photography. And drones allow the project team to collect detailed data on damages. They can fly at low altitudes and take quality images of all buildings. Where they aren't able to use drones because it's too far into enemy-controlled territory, they use high-resolution satellite images. To ensure completeness of the input data, the project team then takes photos and videos, as well as collecting additional information from verified sources regarding the building heights, the type, the addresses, and so forth. The third step is trying to assess what's the level of damage. So the photos are turned into orthophoto plans with an AI model and GIS specialists then digitize all the buildings. They identify the destroyed objects. And for each object, what was its size? How many floors did it have? What was the building type? And what was the level of damage? You can see here, these are some of the different types, different levels of damage. There's total destruction. There's light damage. There's severe damage. Then there's possible damage. And it may be damaged, it may not. We can't tell from the AI and from the remote sensing. AI models are used for faster footprint detection. And then they compare the war damage imagery, that is to say this sort of imagery, with pre-war imagery, sometimes from Google Maps, for each individual building. They then upload the information on each building the fully digitized data and the processed imagery. It's stored in a proprietary IT system that allows easy access, comparison to other maps, and graphic analysis and reporting. So far, they've looked at more than 325 settlements. They've analyzed more than 1 million buildings. And of those 1 million buildings, they have identified more than 93,000 buildings that have been damaged to one extent or another. Most of this has been in the East and South. So where do we stand with the war in Ukraine? Well, Ukraine has recaptured approximately half of the occupied territories. Russia still controls about 18% of Ukraine's total landmass, mostly in the east and south. There's been about $350 billion in aid to Ukraine, including $77 billion from the United States. There's more that's being debated in Congress as we speak. There have been approximately 22,000 civilian deaths, 5 million internally displaced persons, and more than 6 million refugees. In terms of military casualties, Russian casualties are estimated at 315,000. This is an astounding number. This is approximately 90% of the army as it stood before the conflict. And so there's been a lot of efforts to try to recruit new soldiers on both sides. Ukrainian military casualties are estimated at 70,000 dead and 100,000 wounded, and they too have been trying to recruit. Some reports highlighting challenges with that. So that's kind of the infrastructure impacts. I'd like to shift briefly to some of the environmental impacts. We do see that the war in Ukraine is taking a significant toll on the environment. President Zelensky has accused Russia of committing ecocide. And ecocide is currently a crime under Ukrainian law and under the law of 12 other countries. It is not yet a crime under international law. Ukraine and others are pushing for ecocide to be recognized in the Rome Statute under international criminal law. And this would be parallel to genocide, to crimes against humanity, to war crimes, and to crimes of aggression. I should be very clear here that even if the ICC does recognize ecocide, the Rome Statute has a strong aversion to retroactive application of the law. I'll be more clear about that. The Rome Statute, when it adds a new crime, it's only a crime that is prosecutable from that day on. So since ecocide is not yet a crime under the Rome Statute, none of the actions to date could be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. They could be prosecuted, no, that should be clear. They could not be prosecuted as ecocide. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it could be prosecuted under Ukrainian law. There's a partnership with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, trying to use rebuilding as an opportunity for a green transition. The environmental impacts on the pollution side, there's concerns about air, water, and soil pollution. On the air side, Ukraine used to be, until about 2001, they were one of the major consumers of asbestos used in residential buildings. Now, with a lot of the buildings in eastern and southern Ukraine, residential buildings bombed, there's a lot of war debris, a lot of rubble. This rubble has, in many cases, asbestos. There's also pollution caused by the destruction of industrial facilities. by the flooding, which liberated a lot of chemicals. This is the Kakhovka Dam burst, and from munitions. Biologically, about 30% of the country's protected areas, spanning 1.2 million acres, suffer from the effects of war. Forest ecosystems have been burned and frequently filled with destroyed or abandoned equipment. Ukraine's coasts, which are a unique steppe grassland ecosystem, have 44 endemic plant species and homes to more than 400 types of fish and flowering species. There are 20 species that are concerned with going extinct due to the war. And we've seen die-offs of dolphins in the Black Sea near Odessa. There's a strong desire to build back better, to have what's called a green recovery. Sounds good, doesn't it? What is it? Well, that's where we're still trying to figure it out. But the principle is that we should build back better. It should be a green, sustainable, environmentally friendly recovery. There's thought of trying to do this sector by sector. Already there's rebuilding going on. This creates many challenges because according to the laws that Ukraine has adopted, there's supposed to be an environmental impact assessment for anything that might have a substantial impact on the environment. Now, in the middle of a war, you don't want to sit and wait to do the environmental impact assessment. You just need to focus your energy, get it done, or get it done well enough, and move on. So Ukraine has suspended the rules governing environmental impact assessment until the war ends. This has been challenged by civil society, including before the Aarhus Compliance Committee. This is the Compliance Committee for the UN ECE Convention on Public Participation. There are a number of alternatives that are under discussion. One is to use existing EIAs. So if a project was built a few years ago, there will be an environmental impact assessment, and one could use that. There's use of strategic environmental assessments for clusters of related projects. And there's the possibility that some projects, particularly those that may have a substantial environmental impact, still require an EIA. And in addition to questions of the environmental impact assessment process, there's a question of how to manage the disposal of all that rubble that contains asbestos. Should this be treated as hazardous waste? Should it be just taken care of, ignoring the law? What about other hazardous waste? Shifting gears to accountability. The first thing I want to say, I mentioned ecocide earlier. Ecocide is one idea. But the truth is, there's a lot of international law that applies. In 2022, the International Law Commission adopted principles on protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts. These are principles of international law. They are existing law. But the interesting thing here is they didn't just focus on international humanitarian law, which is often called the law of war. But they also looked at international criminal law. They looked at international environmental law, international human rights law, the law of occupation, the UN Charter. And this is really important because by looking at these other bodies of law, many of the weaknesses that we see in international humanitarian law can be filled by other bodies of law. I think the most interesting aspect here is the law on aggression. And I'll talk momentarily about the other provisions of international law that Ukraine has arguably violated. But the fact is, the law of aggression has a very simple premise. Under the UN Charter, Article 2, Paragraph 4, the Charter says that all members shall, this is mandatory, all members shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. This prohibits aggressive war. And we have seen where countries violate this prohibition on aggressive war, there's an obligation to make full reparations. This came up in the 1990-91 Gulf War, where Iraq invaded Kuwait. And it's very interesting to look at this date. You know, this is right after the end of the Cold War. Russia and the US are cooperating. China's being quiet. And the Security Council had a series of resolutions trying to push Iraq to stop its aggressive war. Ultimately, they adopted a resolution that held Iraq liable for all damages. And as part of the surrender in early 1991, they had to agree to pay compensation. This created the UN Compensation Commission. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But more to the point, they didn't say, we're going to figure out which damages, violated which standards of international law. There was none of that. Liability was presumed for all damages of the war. This includes the damage that Iraq caused to Kuwait, the damage that Iraq caused to other countries, and the damages that were created by the international community as they liberated Kuwait. In other words, any damage that was caused after the invasion was due to the war. Iraq was liable for all of those damages. And you don't have to worry about any of the different standards about was there long-term widespread and severe damage, was there a military target. The war was aggressive, it was illegal, and therefore the aggressor had to pay. This was the same thing for the war in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the International Court of Justice held Uganda liable for the damage to the infrastructure and to the environment and to public and to private property. And then, and it also was a factor in the Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Tribunal. So this provision on aggression is really important here. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But there are other more specific requirements that Ukraine has seen violated by the Russian invasion. The first and probably the clearest are prohibitions on indiscriminate attacks on civilian objects. This includes the environment, it includes infrastructure. It's prohibited under the Geneva Convention, under Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention, and under the Rome Statute. And I want to be clear here. Additional Protocol 1 and the Geneva Conventions generally apply to states. They create obligations for states. The Rome Statute is international criminal law. This creates obligations for individuals. So we're talking about prohibitions that protect both, that govern actions both by states and by individuals. And this goes back to the Nuremberg trials. And we can see it with the scorched earth policies. And there were a few different trials challenging actions by usually generals, German generals, for scorched earth tactics. Some were convicted, some were acquitted. The ones that were acquitted, they perceived that it was necessary, militarily necessary, to deprive the pursuing army of resources. Where the generals were convicted, it was viewed as being punitive, trying to punish the Russians or the other people as the German army retreated. Other legal causes of action include protections governing works and installations containing dangerous forces. This is protected under Additional Protocol 1, governing international armed conflict. It explicitly protects dams and nuclear power plants. One thing that's interesting is that the Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Tribunal saw a claim where a reservoir had been bombed. No damages were awarded, though, because there was no visible impact. So if the reservoir had flooded and destroyed communities downriver, that would have been compensable. But because the bomb just landed in the water and sprayed people, but it didn't actually cause flooding or other damage, no monies were awarded. We also see objects indispensable to the civilian population. This is often in the context of starvation, so crops, agricultural areas, livestock, and so forth. Also drinking water installations and supplies. One of the interesting things is where the protections are more about the other crimes associated with the context. And so we see that like the illegal extraction of minerals often comes with slavery and torture. And there may be some arguments similar for, say, Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, where the former workers are not being paid. They're being forced to manage the plant under penalty of death. I mentioned ecocide here, pillage, plunder, and looting. And one of the really interesting things, what I've been talking about here is the law, right? The fact is, the growing number of tribunals actually prosecute people for violating the law. We saw this in Nuremberg. We saw it with the UN Compensation Commission, with over $5 billion in environmental damages. Again, this is for the Iraq invasion of Kuwait in 1990-91. The International Court of Justice awarding damages to the Democratic Republic of the Congo for Uganda's illegal invasion. That includes damage to property, damage to the environment, and damage to persons. We've seen a number of international tribunals also prosecuting these crimes, and a number of national courts and tribunals. Sometimes it is where the conflict occurred, like in Colombia and Croatia. Other times it's other countries with citizens who are doing things that they should not be doing in those countries. Some of it on pillage. It's especially useful for crimes with universal jurisdiction. And to kind of think about what does all this mean for Ukraine? First, there's a very clear legal basis, grounded in part on UN Charter, Article 2, Paragraph 4, but then also with all these other provisions, both of international humanitarian law and international criminal law. the big question is, how do you do it? How do you actually prosecute, whether it's the state or individuals? For criminal liability, there's the possibility of pursuing some of the people through the International Criminal Court, but until President Putin or other leaders in Ukraine, in Russia, are actually captured, the cases are unlikely to move forward very far. Trying them in Ukraine might be easier in some ways if you can get personal jurisdiction, but it's not very credible. And on the state responsibility side, this is compensation for the damages associated with the regression. One question is, where are we going to get the funds? And there's a possibility of seizing frozen assets. The U.S. has seized has frozen over $100 billion in Russian state assets. And the EU, the European Union, has frozen more than $200 billion in state assets. Now, the difficulty here is that there are questions around whether states have sovereign immunity. Can these funds be seized? At least in the U.S., case law is clear. The U.S. has seized frozen state assets at least 7 times in the past, from Syria, Iran, Venezuela, and so forth. So the U.S. could seize it if it wanted to. Canada has said that they will seize the frozen assets. Belgium has said, we don't think we can seize the assets, but the assets are sitting in a bank. They're gathering interest. We can seize the interest. And so there's kind of an ongoing process to figure out which countries can seize what. And a lot of this, frankly, comes down to political will. And I say this because, as we saw in Western Europe in the 1930s, if a state is aggressive and it is not punished, it will continue to be aggressive and it will grow. And so the question is, how do we make sure that there is accountability and not impunity? With that, I thank you for your attention.
どうも、ブルック博士、ありがとうございました。非常に詳細なご説明、感謝申し上げます。さて、一つ、視聴者の皆様からのご質問を紹介する前に、私と少し、ブルック博士の間で、会話してみたいと思います。ブルック博士、私は長い間、自然災害あるいはインフラストラクチャーの建設による移住の問題を扱ってきておりました。で、例えば東日本大震災で自分の家を離れて移住することを余儀なくされた人は47万人という数字が出ております。他方、これは UNHCR 国連難民高等弁務官事務所が今年の早い時期で上げていた数字だと記憶しておりますけれども、ウクライナから国外に逃れた人は800万人、国内での別のところに逃れた人は600万人という非常に大きな数字が出ております。日本も2000人の避難者を受け入れております。復興を考えるときに、これは、自然災害による復興でも、あるいは、戦争でもおそらく考える基本は同じだと思うのですけれども、何人の人が以前の住居に帰ってくるんだろうかというのは、復興を考えるときの重要な問題だと思います。そして、福島での例を我々調査したことがありますけれども、自分の住んでいたところを離れて、他のところに避難した人は、その避難先で生活する時間が長くなると、自分の家に帰るという動機を 失う傾向にあるようです。まだ戦争は終わっておりませんから、明確な方針というものは出ていないのだと思いますけれども、戦争が終わった時点で、すべての人が元の自宅に、あるいは元自宅があった地域に帰ることを前提として、ウクライナ政府は復興計画を立てるのでしょうか。あるいはこれはウクライナ政府の方針がまだ確定しなければ、ブルック博士のお考えで結構なのですけれども、復興計画の基盤となる、どれくらいの人が戦争が終わったら、かつて住んでいたところに帰ってくるのか。これについて、ウクライナ政府、あるいはブルック博士ご自身のご見解でも構いませんが、ご存知のところをお聞かせいただければ幸いです。まず私からの最初の質問です。
That is a fantastic question. Um, I'll give you a lawyer's response. It depends. It depends on whether what does peace look like? Does Russia still occupy some portion of Ukraine? If Russia continues to occupy that part of Ukraine, I think it's unlikely Ukrainians will want to go back or that they will. Um, I'm talking about peace here. If if it's a question of going back to urban settings where the apartment buildings have been destroyed, I think that there could be a number of people who will go back. I think there are probably going to be fewer people who return to rural life, in part because we saw that people in rural areas often suffered, they were greatly exposed by the conflict. And I think that there's a reluctance to continue that exposure. You made a point which I think is really important, and that is that the longer people are gone, the more they create new lives for themselves. We saw this uh, with Hurricane Katrina. People who left New Orleans temporarily to go to to go to Texas or elsewhere, and they found, the schools here are pretty good. I can get a job. They don't have the same community, but we can make it work. And the longer they were gone, the less likely they were to come back. We saw similar things with Fukushima. The longer people were gone, the more they created new lives for themselves. I think that will be the case here. So how long does it take to get peace? And who is occupying the land? The other thing which I think is a big question, especially for the international refugees. Many of those are women and children. Ukraine has been very cautious about letting men leave. And so often with the current situation, families are often split. And I think there's a powerful incentive for people to reunite. They might not reunite in their original homes. They might resettle in Kyiv. A lot of people moved internally westward, and that may be perceived as safer, especially if there isn't a good, clear delineation of Russian territory and Ukrainian territory. This I think, is a really important question.
はい、どうもありがとうございます。えー一つ、質問を頂戴しております。これはグリーンリカバリーについてです。確かに既存のエネルギー関連のインフラストラクチャーが破壊されたことは、 再生可能エネルギー源に転換する非常に良い機会かもしれません。しかし、ウクライナの気候や風土では、再生可能エネルギーに大きくエネルギー源を転換するということは、なかなか困難ではないかという見解をこの質問者の方は持っておられます。このウクライナのグリーンリカバリーについて、化石燃料から再生可能エネルギーにエネルギー源を転換することについては、どのような考え方に、復興計画は基づこうとしているのか、あるいはブルック先生自身のご見解として、どのような考え方を取るべきなのかについてお聞かせいただけるでしょうか。
Another very good question. The truth is, there are many reasons for green recovery has many dimensions. There's construction, there's energy, there is food, there's how cities are planned. Um, that said, there are some very interesting aspects of renewable energy. One of them is that in the years leading up to the war, Russia, on a number of instances, stopped the flow of natural gas into Ukraine, and used natural gas as an economic weapon. And so Ukrainians remember this, and even if there's peace, they need to have more energy independence. But the interesting thing about what's happening during armed conflict right now, and for the last more than 600 days, that if a coal-fired power plant or an oil-fired power plant gets bombed, it takes weeks, if not months, to repair it. But when a solar facility gets targeted, and there have been a few that have been targeted, you basically go through and you figure out which of the solar panels are still usable. You just hook them up to the cable. So you lay a new cable. It takes a day or 2 days, maybe 3 days at the outset to get energy going again for solar panels. And so Ukraine has been pushing, they've been consuming a lot of the solar panels, have been installing it. And this has actually had an effect on the European market for solar panels because Ukraine has been buying so many of them. The other thing which I think is interesting, and we don't talk about it as much, is energy efficiency. And when I was first in Ukraine in 1998, there was part of what's called joint implementation. And the idea was under the Kyoto Protocol that the US could get credits, climate change credits, not by reducing its emissions, but by helping somebody else reduce their emissions. And so the US was helping Ukraine, and Ukraine had an energy arrangement, a heating arrangement for a lot of its buildings that they inherited from the Soviets. The way that you adjusted the temperature in your apartment or in your hotel during wintertime was to open the window. There was no thermostat. They just heated it really high. If you wanted it a little lower, you opened the window a couple centimeters, or you opened it wide, depending on what you wanted. And so trying to improve energy efficiency in Ukraine be another step of the green recovery directly connected to energy efficiency. But I don't think that I don't know what the prospects are for full renewable energy, but Ukraine is a large country and it has quite a bit of capacity to have solar and wind. And they've been installing a substantial amount of that over the last 2 years. Thank you.
はい、どうも、ブルック博士ありがとうございます。視聴者の方から一つ質問を頂戴しております。これは少し、これまでの話とは別の局面で、金融に関するインフラストラクチャーに関する質問です。英語で質問をいただいているんですけれども、多くの視聴者の方は日本語が母国語だと思いますので、私の方で日本語に翻訳したものを読むことにさせていただきます。破壊されたり損傷したりしたインフラストラクチャーの初期の再建はおそらく海外からの援助に頼ることになるだろう。しかし、復旧したインフラストラクチャーを運営維持するためには、ウクライナ国内の資金調達システム、つまり国内での金融システムが極めて重要になる。物理的なインフラストラクチャーの再建において、金融に関わるインフラストラクチャーはどのように組み込まれるべきでしょうか。例えばこれについて、ブルック博士は金融の専門家と話をされたことはあるでしょうかというご質問です。
Um, Another great question. Um, I will note at the outset that Ukraine has had problems over the last 30 years with corruption. And this has been something that President Zelensky has tried at different times to address. And when certain people have had accusations of corruption, he has replaced them. Um, but I think that there's concern that with that much money flowing in for reconstruction, that creates an environment that is ripe for corruption. And so I think there's a question about whether the money would be going through the Ukrainian financing system or whether it would go through some sort of independent international financing system. I think the general sense is right now there's a caution, a reluctance to have the money go through the Ukrainian financing system, but to have Ukrainian engagement in making decisions about how to spend the money. So uh, there are there are people that are involved in the discussions uh, regarding finance and corruption, but it's more how do you have an international arrangement that helps rebuild without feeding domestic corruption. And I should also say this is coming at it from the damage and green recovery side. I don't know if if there are other discussions, other dialogues that are happening specifically on strengthening the domestic financing system. I haven't seen that. Most of what I've seen has been concerns about corruption and therefore about international management and oversight of the monies. Professor Nakayama, there was another question about the methodologies
はい。
for
え、
assessing environmental damages. Would you like me to address that?
はい。私の方から改めて質問を読み上げます。環境影響評価について、あるいは環境への影響について、どの程度の被害が出たかについては、従来使われている方法論で 評価するということと、それから革新的な方法論で評価するという、多分その両方が行われるんだと思うのですけれども、えこの両者の使い分け、あるいはその革新的な方法論として、お話の中でも紹介されましたけれども、どのような方法論が現在適用されようとしているのかについてご存知の範囲で教えていただければ幸いです。以上。
So this is, I think, in terms of the timing of the of collecting information, of assessing environmental damages, Ukraine is probably the most advanced. That most wars, the environmental damage assessment comes toward the end or at the end after the conflict is over. Very early on, Ukraine realized that there was a lot of environmental damage. Ukraine has a very well-developed civil society, the groups that I've been working with over the last 25 years plus. And they have been working with the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources to catalog the environmental impacts in real time. And the question, I think it's important to ask, what is the purpose of assessing the environmental damages? Is it for liability purposes? Is it for planning purposes so that we know where all the damages are and we can prioritize? Is it for public relations purposes? I say this because if it's for planning or public relations, that's one thing. But if you have an international tribunal, like we saw with the UN Compensation Commission, it's really important to have methodologies that are internationally recognized. The environmental damages before the UN Compensation Commission, there were 85 billion, again, that's $85 billion claimed. 5.26 billion were awarded. That is about 6%. In other words, 94% of the claimed damages were rejected. Why were they rejected? Generally, it was because they had bad evidence, because they couldn't show that the damage was caused by the war, or because the methodologies that they used were not recognized by international law or by international practice. Ukraine developed a series of methodologies, domestic methodologies, regarding how to assess damage to the water, to the soil, and so forth. Question that I think has not been adequately answered is, are these methodologies consistent with international practice? If you submit data to them, if you submit the evidence to a tribunal, would an international tribunal look at it and say, we have chain of custody, we have we have multiple samples that have been sent to different labs, the results are consistent? Those sorts of very basic approaches, do the existing Ukrainian methodologies provide for that? And then there's the question of not just assessing the damages, the environmental damage, but the valuation. Suppose you can show that there are damages. How do you value the damages? Again, what's the international good practice? What is expected? And I think this is where we have some really good examples from the UN Compensation Commission that we can learn from. A lot of what's being collected right now and documented does not meet international standards for a tribunal. It doesn't mean that that's useless. It just means you have to be careful about using it in a tribunal. It could be useful for helping to identify and prioritize where to do environmental remediation. But that's a different function. And so I think it's important to note what's the purpose and how effective are the existing methodologies for that particular purpose.
ありがとうございます。今話が出ました賠償について一つ質問をいただいております。どのような質問かと言いますと、復興に関するロシアの責任についての質問なのですけれども、ウクライナが復興するための資金を国や国際機関などが提供する場合、これらの国や国際機関は最終的にこのような提供した資金の賠償をロシアに求めることができるのでしょうかという質問です。
Which institutions would be claiming compensation?
質問は国あるいは国際機関というふうに書いてあるので、ごく一般的な意味で開発援助を与える先進国やあるいは開発援助に関わる国際機関を想定していると思います。
Yeah. This is getting into some, for me, some very interesting questions. The model for the UN Compensation Commission was a model of international arbitration. That is basically state versus state. Now, it's not just Iraq and Kuwait, but it also included Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and other countries. Sometimes there were countries that provided assistance to put out the oil well fires or to clean up the desert. And so they had spent money to help stop the environmental damage, to help remediate the environmental damage, and they asked for their expenses to be paid by the defendant, by Iraq. Now, sometimes the expenses were incurred by a state, by a country, but often they were incurred by corporations or by individuals or by other organizations. But so there was what we would call a legal fiction, or basically the state would submit it, but these were claims for damages by by an entity, and they would be adjudicated by the UN Compensation Commission. Awards would be decided, whether to give an award and how much. And what was really interesting was that the UNCC, the UN Compensation Commission, then said, here's the money, show us that you paid the rightful people the amount. And so where there were claims to damages to private property or to public health or to infrastructure, the government needed to not only pay, but they had to show that they paid. And that was very interesting because you wound up, in some cases, the government couldn't find the people. And they went back to the UN Compensation Commission and said, we're sorry, these 6 people, we don't know where they are. Here's the money back. So it's, it was very interesting because the states acted as the legal representatives or the compensation process. But often it was non-governmental actors, whether for profit or private or otherwise, is often non-governmental actors, private individuals, who were the ones that were damaged, and they were the ones that were compensated. But I think that this also raises a really tricky question of how on earth are we going to hold Russia accountable? For the UN Compensation Commission, that was set up by the Security Council. Russia is a permanent member. As a permanent member, it can veto anything that it doesn't like. So if there's a proposal to have a compensation mechanism for the war in Ukraine, Russia can veto it. So the UN Security Council is not the path to take. There was a resolution in late 2022 by the UN General Assembly to support the development of a register of damages for the war in Ukraine. This is all damages: environment, infrastructure, private property, life, public health. And that register of damages has been created. It has more than 40 countries, mostly Europe and North America, but more than 40 countries have agreed to it. And as of a month ago, they appointed the leadership, and it is starting to move forward. At this point, it's not compensation. It is, at this point, focused on documenting the damages. They're not going to the field. They're creating a space where governments and non-governmental authorities can document. But there is a move to try to then use this architecture to provide compensation. So we shall see how that proceeds. But I think it's important to note that there is this register of damages. It had the UN General Assembly endorsement or the kind of approval for the idea. Whether that will continue to go through the General Assembly, we shall see, or if it is simply a matter of like-minded countries. But again, the question would be, so what's the source of the money that they're going to, if they award compensation, how do you make sure that there's money that is to be paid? I think that's when we get back to this question of seizing assets. And there are both Russian state assets and assets of Russian oligarchs. Under US law, it's much easier to seize state assets than it is to seize private assets. But that may be different in other countries. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to mention, especially on the green recovery and on kind of rebuilding after extensive damage, I think that Japan probably has some very interesting experiences that could inform what's happening in Ukraine. I'm thinking about post Kobe after the earthquake, and then post 3/11 after the great East Japan earthquake. I think both of those, the extent of damages and the amount of work that needed to be done to recover, created some interesting experiences about how to proceed effectively and also somewhat efficiently.
どうもありがとうございました。セミナーの時間、あと9分ぐらいなので、これが最後の質問になるかと思います。戦後の復興、インフラストラクチャーを再建するためには、多くの労働力が必要です。しかし今、ウクライナでは多くの人が国内あるいは国外に逃れています。戦後の復興における労働力は十分に、確保できるというふうにウクライナ政府は見ているんでしょうか。あるいは、もし、これは可能性の問題ですけれども、労働力の不足を補うために AI、人工知能やロボットなどの最新技術を活用するということは計画されているんでしょうか。短い質問です。短い答えをお願いできれば幸いです。
I haven't heard anyone in Ukraine talking about the labor question. I think is a good question. Right now, the vast majority of rebuilding is being done with Ukrainian labor, but it's mostly triage, trying to keep the infrastructure going, repair the roads with temporary fixes, fill the potholes, fill the whatever, get the power lines back up. The AI used to try to assess the damages. Um, I haven't heard or seen anything about how AI or other non-human technologies might be used to do the actual repair. It's an interesting question, though.
ありがとうございました。質問はこれで終わりにしたいと思いますが、本日のセミナーにご参加いただいた皆様に感謝するとともに、えーいささか、面倒な質問にも的確に答えてくださり、また、ウクライナの現状について詳細な情報を提供してくださったブルック博士に深く感謝申し上げたいと思います。加えて、的確な、通訳をしてくださいました2人の同時通訳者の方々にも深く感謝を申し上げます。ブルック博士、このセミナーを締める前に最後にこれからの、ブルック先生のウクライナへの関わりも含めて、えーこのセミナーを、参加している我々、あるいは、日本の、国民へのメッセージをいただければと思います。お願いいたします。
Um, I'd like to start by saying that I think GIF has a very important mission that recognizing the important role that large scale infrastructure has for global peace. There really aren't many organizations on this planet, none that I know of, that really understand that the way that GIF does. I think that the situation in Ukraine remains is very urgent. It's very serious. It's also has significant uncertainties. When will the war end? How are we going to rebuild? Who's going to rebuild? Where's the money coming from? Is it going to be green or is it just going to be greenish? The question is, there are so many questions that I think it's very important that we have the discussions like we have tonight or this morning in the case in Tokyo. That said, I think it's important to continue the discussion because there are going to be a lot of questions that come up both in defining what recovery looks like and in defining what accountability looks like. What are the mechanisms? Who's going to be held accountable and how? For what? I think these are all questions that are still being sorted through. And there is actually a lot of discussion about damage to the environment in Ukraine and accountability for that, and to Kakhovka Dam, and damage to the nuclear power plants. The question of damage to broader infrastructure, that's not something that I hear about as much, but I think that it's really important. I think that some of the experiences that we have had with the Marshall Plan in Europe, but also with large-scale rebuilding in Japan and elsewhere after a major disaster, after a catastrophic disaster, or after war, are going to be very important in guiding recovery in Ukraine. For that, I want to thank you for your attention. It's been a pleasure, as always, and thank you.
ブルック博士、本当に本日はありがとうございました。時差の関係で一日のお仕事でお疲れの後、準備も含めて2時間以上もこのセミナーのために時間を割いてくださったことに深く感謝申し上げます。それではこれをもちまして本日のオンラインセミナーを閉じたいと思います。皆様どうもありがとうございました。